Okay, for the BEWBC, February 25th, 2021. My name is Nick Davis. I'll give a brief introduction to myself here. I am a master sommelier and from Seattle, Washington. This is my hometown. I went to Ballard High School and then University of Washington after that, and then started my career in bars and restaurants here in the city. That career started in 2011, and my interest was first in cocktails, which I gained after a visit to the Zigzag, which is a great cocktail bar in the Pike Place Market. And from there, started working in bars and restaurants. And then during my time at Canlis Restaurant at Queen Anne, I gained more of an interest in wines of the world and both United States local wines and things from regions everywhere, and started my path in studying. And then in 2019, I passed the Master Sommelier exam, which is the fourth exam in a series by the Court of Master Sommeliers. And shortly after passing the exam, we found ourselves in COVID times. So whereas I would hope to be doing more education in person and traveling, I now find myself doing Zoom calls. But that's a lot of fun still, and we get to engage with people from around the world that way, which is great. But I do look forward to doing more in-person tastings soon. So Stacy, who many of you may have met, she reached out to me to get this organized, and I thought it'd be a really great idea. And we landed on the topic of Syrah, which is a favorite grape of mine. And we have two wines here, and hopefully you have opened yours already and may have even started tasting the Owen Roe from here in Washington State, Yakima Valley, and then the Fowry Syrah. And this is from the Rhône region in France. And we'll talk about each in detail. So that will be a really nice comparison between Old World and New World, and we'll discuss those.
Hey, Nick.
Yes.
Which one are you going to start with first?
Well, we'll get to it. We'll get to it, but we'll start with the Owen Roe. So if you haven't opened yours yet, we'll start with the Owen Roe and then go into the Fowry.
It looked like Stacy was having some sound problems on her end, so she's
okay. Can you hear me okay, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, I'll keep going there, and generally let me know if there's any other technical issues. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm okay too. Thank you, Nick.
Hi, Stacy.
Hi.
All right. Ni hao. So let's talk a little bit about Syrah in terms of the spectrum of classic wine grapes in the world. I like to think of them in three categories. There are the light pigmented grapes like Pinot Noir, Gamay, Nebbiolo, and then there's the deeply pigmented grapes. We're thinking of Syrah in this case, along with Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec. And then there's some grapes that are in between that can be sometimes light and sometimes deeply colored. Tempranillo, Cabernet Franc, Zinfandel, those would kind of be in that middle category. But with Syrah, a really classic, important part of it is its color, as well as its complexity and aromatic depth. And it has now found a home all over the world, but is originally from the Rhône Valley in France. And we'll get into the parentage of Syrah a little bit later. But the aromatic elements tend to be on that savory side. And depending on the exact example, Syrah can get really funky and crazy and weird, and may not actually be the favorite wine for the uninitiated. It's a bit of an acquired taste, a bit in the way of, exotic vegetables like eggplant or organ meats or kombucha, just these foods that have really strong flavors. I think Syrah is kind of a wine version of that in its more extreme expressions. But in some more mild expressions, it just is full of fruit and texture and weight. So it can go with a lot of different foods, but overall, it tends to be a very complex, delicious wine. And I really love the possibility that Syrah has at the table for exotic, full flavored foods, whether they're complex Asian dishes like a Thai eggplant, or even a snack favorite like pepperoni pizza that you might even heat up from the freezer section. I think Syrah can do really well with foods that have a lot of flavor. And I would actually avoid plain, boring foods because they're going to get lost if you have Syrah on the table. So definitely go for big, intense foods with exotic flavors. Now, where it's grown around the world is an interesting chart to look at. And this is a chart from the Wine Grapes. It's a free ebook that you can get from Kim Anderson, University of Adelaide. And this is a book that's come out in multiple editions over the years. But far and away, the most Syrah is grown in France, followed by Australia. Then we surprisingly have Spain and Argentina and South Africa with more plantings than the United States. Then some smaller countries like Chile, Italy, and Portugal. So United States, not the biggest grower of Syrah in the world, but definitely some of the most interesting examples come from here. Now this chart on the right, the varietal intensity index, is neat to see. Myanmar doesn't have a lot of plantings, but of the ones it does have, Syrah makes up a surprising high majority. Same with Thailand and Cambodia. And then, no surprise, Australia is very high in Syrah, or Shiraz, as they might call it. And in terms of specific plantings, getting onto this technical chart here, France has 62,000 hectares versus the United States only at 9,000. So about a 6x difference. And, the Rhône has a lot of Syrah, but we also get down into like the Languedoc region of southern France, kind of by Marseille. And there's a lot of just high volume plantings going on there. So, just volume and plantings is one thing, but quality is a whole other ballgame.
Steve is having trouble to connect. Steve Foyce.
Who's that?
I don't know. Stacy, maybe you can help him.
Yes, I'm texting him right now.
Founding father. We probably need to wait for him. He's an important one.
All right, let me continue to work with him directly.
Okay.
Is he in the waiting room?
No, nobody's in the waiting room.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep going just in the interest of our time constraints here. We have a lot of material to get through. There are some regions in the world where Syrah makes up a high proportion. So like in Ventura County, United States, there's a very high percentage of Syrah there. And we're seeing that in all these Australian regions, Syrah is a dominant grape. So that's interesting to see. Now we can get some wine in the glass, and that will be good to try. And as I'm pouring this one, I love looking at the color. This is the Rhône Ex Umbris Syrah. And it's interesting, it has a very plain front label, and all the interesting data is on the back. Yakima Valley. Ex Umbris, meaning from the shadows. The winery itself, founded in 1999, has now been around for over 20 years. And the Ex Umbris itself came about in 2002. Rhône is based in Wapato, Washington. We'll take a look at a map here. But they make a whole different range of wines. They make almost 20 or 30 different wines depending on the year, and quite a large operation. So compared to the Faury, which we'll look at a little bit later, Rhône is a much bigger production winery, but they maintain a very high level of quality. So that's great, including red, white, and rosé wines. And the ex umbris itself means out of the shadows. And in 2002, there was some fires that occurred, as we're becoming accustomed to in Washington viticulture. And from the shadows came this wine. So they had some fire damage Syrah, but it ended up turning out really, really nicely. So they have made that every year since 2002. And I looked on Cellar Tracker. You can kind of see some public records of people that still have some 2002 vintage in their cellar. So it'd be interesting to try that. But just looking at the color of the wine, it has this very deep, intense color and elevated alcohol here, 14.1%. So that is a kind of a hallmark of Yakima Valley fruit. Retail price would come in at 25% or $25, excuse me. Looking at the map of just Washington State, this is from Google Maps, we can see that Wapato, where the winery is based, is near the city of Yakima. So not more than a couple hours from Seattle over I-90. And maybe split in the time difference between Seattle and Walla Walla. So if you're doing a road trip to Walla Walla, I recommend stopping in Yakima if you're going to take the trip in the day and doing lunch there and a tasting at Owen Row. They have a really cool winemaking facility that I've had the chance to visit, and it's there's vineyards right there, and they get a lot of fruit from that Yakima Valley AVA. And AVA, referring to American Viticultural Area, is how Washington wine is organized. And we can look at the AVA map here of Washington State and see the different viticultural areas that exist. And the very large shape is Columbia Valley, and within Columbia Valley are smaller, more specific AVA regions. But overall, most Washington wines are going to be labeled by Columbia Valley, and then if they're from these more specific areas, you might see Red Mountain or Walla Walla Valley. We even have some new regions coming just in this past year. Royal Slope is one that's kind of in the northern part, and then Candy Mountain is next to Red Mountain there. So that's a fun name of that region. But the kind of complication of the map here is partly due to the growth of Washington wine over the last 20 to 40 years. It's really exploded, and there's more and more wineries being founded every year. So let's talk through kind of how this wine tastes and what makes it unique as far as a New World wine and a Washington wine. In tasting this, one of the first things that I notice is a intense focus on fruit in the wine, and that really shines through. And I think of New World wines, which are wines from anywhere outside of Europe, as often having a focus on fruit with a very glossy texture. Compared, we remember when we used to print out photographs, you can choose between glossy paper or matte finish. The Old World wines tend to be a little bit more rugged and matte versus the glossy, round polish of a New World wine. So the fruit really shines through here, and a focus on black fruits. So blackberry, black plum, there's even some blueberry and black currant coming through there. So a whole host of these different ripe black fruits. And I'm finding also some of the savory elements that we get in Syrah, rosemary and black pepper, even some leather and cigar tobacco. So a whole host of different aromatic complex notes. We find most of the Syrah in Washington State between two areas, Yakima Valley, and then also in the southeast part of the state with Walla Walla. So those are definitely two interesting areas to look for. We're not seeing as much Syrah down here in Columbia Gorge. The area is quite a bit cooler than the main part of Columbia Valley. So it is going to be better for white grapes and kind of these lighter red grapes, but Syrah definitely likes sunshine and heat and is successful in those environments. We also see on the west side of the Cascades, the Puget Sound AVA, but it is very cool compared to the high sunshine of Eastern Washington. So although some grapes do ripen and make successful wine, in the state, it's very interesting that most of the fruit comes over the mountains and is made in places like Woodinville, or is made on site in places like Prosser or Wapato. So I would say that in terms of New World Syrah, this is very consistent with what we might see in Washington and even California. I think that there's more of an earthiness here in a Washington Syrah than I would expect from California, which tends to really go to the extremes of ripeness with a lot more of new oak presence. And this might even, I think it has a touch of whole cluster, which we can talk about in a little bit. But I find it to be a balanced wine and a great value at $25.
Hey, Nick.
Yes, sir.
Hey, do you know which vineyard or vineyards this is from, or which parts of the valley?
You know, this is actually a higher production wine that I don't know if it comes from one specific vineyard, but they do have a lot of contracts with De Brule. So if you ever have any De Brule fruit, there's a chance that it came from here. Also, Red Willow Vineyard, they get some fruit from there. So,
hey, Nick,
yes.
do you get a lot of white pepper taste with a Syrah? Is that standard, or can you comment on that?
You said black pepper?
Oh, white pepper.
Oh, white pepper. Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, white pepper is something I associate more with white grape varieties. Things like Gruner Veltliner tends to have some of that white pepper aroma, but I could see. I mean, it's kind of a narrow difference sometimes between white pepper and black pepper. But I find white pepper to have, yeah, definitely a funky edge to it. So I can definitely see it being possible. But maybe it's also, I think of like Syrah as being a great steak wine with like a black peppercorn crust, something like that. So it could be partly a factor of suggestion. If we're talking black pepper, I'll cover this in a future slide, but it comes from this chemical in the grape called rotundun, which is a sesquiterpene. And so when we talk about the chemistry of Syrah, we'll get into that a little bit. I want to now highlight our next wine so that we can do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison. And now this is Domaine Faury. These days it's Lionel Faury, but if you see older bottlings, it'll say Philippe Faury, who is the original founder back in 1979. And in looking immediately at the color as I'm pouring this wine, it still has that kind of deep purple color, but there's a bit more, I wouldn't say brown necessarily, but a bit more garnet color that is a component of the hue here. And to me, that would just suggest that the winemaking has a slight more oxidative component. Not that the wine is oxidized by any means, but if we're looking just at the difference in color, I'm seeing more of a slight ruby with the Owen Rowe and a little bit more garnet with the Faury. And I think that's a very subtle distinction, but if I'm in a blind tasting, I might look at the color and just take note of it and say, hey, I see a little bit lighter garnet color here. This Domaine Faury is a favorite among sommeliers who are looking at Rhône wines, and they are well established in the region and make both red and white styles. In terms of red, the single appellations of Saint-Joseph and Côte-Rôtie are famous. And in this image, we see the Emporium. It's an elevated label of Côte-Rôtie that they make. And then also for white wines, making Condrieu and Saint-Joseph. Excellent wines based on Viognier and Marsanne, respectively. And then there's this Colline Rhodanienne. And Colline Rhodanienne is a less limited land regulation. So basically, it's kind of like instead of saying Seattle, we're saying King County or even Puget Sound region. It just is a larger spot on the map, and there's fewer rules on how those wines have to be made. So a little bit more flexibility for the winemakers of how they make the wine, and maybe they can even pick at higher yields, things like that, versus Côte Rôtie, which has very strict regulations. And so what that means is this is a wine that can be made at a higher volume of production, but still maintains a true personality of the region. And the importer is a famous one. This is imported by Kermit Lynch, who's based down in Berkeley, California, and imports all kinds of wines, but especially France is a focus for that importer, and they're also known for things in Burgundy and in Corsica and Provence. So really a ton of great wines that have been promoted by Kermit Lynch over the years. And I think that there's definitely a contrast in the style of this wine compared to the Rhône Row. On the aromatic profile, there's definitely more of a sour tart fruit personality here versus the Rhône Row, which was very ripe and lush. This is like that blackberry that didn't get all the way there. It's a little bit red in some places. So there's a nice tart element both on the nose and the palate. And I think that this wine has more of a sharpness compared to a roundness of the Rhône Row. So that's a little bit abstract in a way, but there's a pointy sharpness to this wine. And the alcohol is 2 degrees lighter. So that causes a big difference in mouthfeel and length of finish. So the finish on this wine is going to be shorter than the Rhône Row, and it may not come across as much of a full-bodied wine. It may feel a little bit lighter, but that sets it up to be really good with delicate foods. So versus the Rhône Row almost demands like heavy, intense, main course type of foods. The Syrah, I mean, I could challenge this to even be served with poultry or fish or vegetable dishes. It just has a bit of a leaner presentation. Retail price comes in just a bit higher than the Rhône Row at $30 here. But I think it does maintain a lot of that Rhône personality that we've come to expect with some of that rustic, almost animal or game leathery quality on kind of the higher parts of the aromatics there. And I think there's even some whole cluster being used here. And when we say whole cluster, that means that basically some of the bunches of grapes came right off of the vine, and instead of removing those berries from the rachis or the skeleton of the stem, they were left on there. And I'll talk about that in detail in a little bit, but the aromatic quality tends to be floral and very perfumed, and it jumps out of the glass. So definitely suspect some whole cluster going on there. And we actually, yes.
Do you happen to know where these vineyards are near to, like where they're sourced from? I mean, it kind of seems like a Saint Joseph.
Yeah, the winery is based in Chavanais, and we'll look at a map here in a second. But it's probably younger vines than they use for their Côte Rôtie and Saint Joseph wines. This doesn't really have the Côte Rôtie personality. I would agree with you. It has more of a Saint Joseph personality if we're choosing one or the other. But my guess is that it comes from younger vines in both areas. I don't know exactly because they don't always tell for these Colline Rodanian wine. But I mean, they could even be buying fruit from anywhere in the Rhône region. But my guess is that it's young vines in the different appellations that they already work with.
So is that, I guess, IGP Colline, Rodentia, whatever that is. Is that Northern Rhône exclusively, or is that anywhere in Rhône?
Yeah, so that's anywhere in mostly the Northern Rhône is where you're going to see that, and it goes a little bit into the Southern Rhône. I actually didn't. I don't know if I put a Colline Rodanienne map in here. We've got a France map and then a Rhône map. So if we're looking just at the Rhône map, it's going to be mostly Northern Rhône, and I don't think it goes into the Southern Rhône at all. So Colline Rodanienne. Let's actually find out, because I'm interested. Colline Rodanienne. I appreciate that question. Yeah, it looks like it's just Northern Rhône. So basically the economic reason for that is to offer less expensive wines that are of the same style from the winery. It kind of is a good way to introduce consumers to the region, and also just is nice that to have, I mean, I think they probably drink this at the winery while the Côte Rôtie and Saint Joseph is aging, kind of thing. Kind of like with in Tuscany, Brunello di Montalcino will be aging in the cellar, and while they are waiting on that, they drink the Rosso di Montalcino. Same kind of idea.
Is it correctly represent this map? So I think you're showing the location of the winery, right? So
Yep.
I'm not exactly familiar what is the North Rhône region, and I mean I can imagine what is south, but that, yeah, that if you can make it bigger a little bit. So what is the north part? Is it close to Lyon or what?
Yep. So on this slide that I have here, the Rhône is all one color. It's all that kind of pink color. The Southern Rhône is actually quite close to Marseille. So it's this big kind of expansive section at the bottom, and then up north, close to Lyon, is the Northern Rhône, and it's actually one of France's smallest regions, the Northern Rhône. It really doesn't produce a high quantity of grapes, and the vineyards are very steep and hard to work. So it's a smaller pocket of France. And from Lyon, I did the drive to Ampuis, which is where Côte Rôtie is, not far from Chavanay, and it takes about 45 minutes from Lyon, so it's not far at all. But I think it'd be cool to, well, maybe I'll pull up another map here and make sure that we have that covered. So if we're talking Northern Rhône and Southern Rhône, that is not a good one.
So what would be the difference between South Rhône, Shiraz, and the Northern?
Well, in Southern Rhône, this is a better map. Okay, so here we are in Northern Rhône, and Chavanay, where this winery is based, is way up here in the north near Côte Rôtie. This is where Syrah is the main game. In this larger Southern Rhône area, it's really Grenache, which is the main grape, and Syrah does appear, but it's more of a secondary blending partner. So if we see things like Côte Rhône, that's going to be a mostly Grenache wine, or Châteauneuf-du-Pape is mostly Grenache. You might come across some of these others like Gigondas or Vaqueiras if you're lucky. It's very rare, I think, for us to see things like Lirac and Baume de Venise in these places. So there's a lot of wine that doesn't ever leave France. So I'd say the one to know from Southern Rhône, Grenache, is Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And the one to know from Northern Rhône is either Hermitage or Côte Rôtie. So Côte Rôtie is here in the very far north, and then Hermitage is this small area. All right. we talk a little bit about how Syrah is adaptive to its environment here in Washington
Excuse me,
State.
Nick. Nick,
Yes, sir.
before you move on there, pardon me, the alcohol content interested me. You said 12% for this French wine and 14% for the Yakima Valley wine. Is that indicative of what I'm going to see? 12% with a little shorter finish?
Yeah, a big part of that is that the alcohol in the wine is going to stick around in your palate for longer, and it's going to continue to evaporate and cause these chemical reactions. So usually the higher alcohol wines are going to have a longer finish, and that tends to just be a fact of their chemistry. That doesn't mean that the Rhône Syrah is less complex, but on a chemical level, glycerol is another type of alcohol that we'll find in fermentation, and definitely you can tell that the viscosity and thickness on the palate is higher with the O and Rho. And a lot of folks might say, oh, that wine has a fuller body and it's better, and that the lower alcohol Rhône wine doesn't have as much character. But I think it's just a sort of a different personality as opposed to like a quality marker. But
Well, I almost look at it differently. I think that the fact that these Rhône Syrahs are under 13 and they're the best Syrahs in the world, that, I mean, it definitely is. The correlation is not between alcohol and quality. It's that this is a growing area that's really suited for Syrah, and it's such a great bonus that it comes in at reasonable alcohol, to make it more, food compatible. And it's fully ripe flavors, but really moderate alcohol.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think the wines are also made for the culture that they are in. So it would totally be possible to let this Rhône Syrah hang for another, 4 or 5 days at harvest and develop those sugars and get to a higher level of alcohol. But at the sacrifice of aromatics, what we see with Syrah is as ripeness increases in the vineyard, the aromatic profile tends to restrict. And so there's less interesting smells, but more interesting maybe texture on the palate. One of my favorite Syrahs is actually from Australia. It's by a winery called Torbreck, and it's called the Laird. It's very rare Syrah, but comes from like 100-year-old vines. And the alcohol is something outrageous, like 15.6. So it's a very high alcohol wine, but it's dry, but it has a thick texture. Almost, saying like maple syrup isn't it's like gravy almost. It's like gravy texture. This wine is just so incredible texturally. So, but it's not something that you can kick back and just enjoy as an aperitif. It like demands almost, a cigar in a fireplace kind of thing. So,
could you tell us the name of that wine again?
Yeah, that's the Laird, Laird, by Torbreck, and it would probably cost you a car payment, but I think it's worth it, but I don't think it's even available. I shouldn't talk about wines that aren't available, but Torbreck is a favorite winery, and they're based in Barossa Valley in Australia. And just for fun, I will go ahead and show you a picture.
Hey, Nick, what kind of car are you talking about there?
Maybe like a 2018 Subaru Legacy. All right. Here we go. So this is the Laird. If you ever see a large format like that, let's talk. While we're at it, I'm going to show you some of my other favorite Syrah wines from around the world, just because we're on this page. Let's look at South Africa. This is one from Sadi family called Columella. It's a blend, but mostly Syrah, and it comes from Swartland area. And it's kind of hard to even make out what that label is, but it's definitely cool. My favorite French Syrah, well, it's hard to pick one, but Jamais Côte Rôtie. This is one of the best wines in the world for sure, and highly recommend it. As with Fowrie, they make a Colleen Rhodanian, kind of a typical thing that winemakers in the area do. And then I won't put too many on here, but probably Chave, Hermitage, Rouge. You know, if you want to team up with some friends and go in for it, this is a life-changing wine for sure, especially in the older vintage. And
You
then,
need
What
to
does that
team
cost?
up with the entire club for that wine.
Now, what does that cost, Nick?
yeah, I mean, I would say Chave, Hermitage, Rouge, depending on the vintage, anywhere from $300 to $600 per bottle.
See, that's what I said.
Unless you go for this one, Cuvée Catalan, which is $6,000 per bottle. Don't worry about that one.
We cannot afford with the club that.
Yeah, everybody can get a thimble. Let's do one from California. I really enjoy Fela Syrah. They're a great winery that's based in Napa Valley, and this is a Hudson Vineyard Syrah from Fela. They do a great example, and then we'll do one more California. How about Colgan Syrah? So, I mean, I'm definitely showing you wines that aren't everyday drinking wines, but are more benchmark, you know, best examples in the world. So, let's see. Okay. We're doing good. We're going to keep going through some more slides that I prepared, and then I want to do, we can stay as long as you want to do question and answer. Here in Washington State and Walla Walla Valley, the soils are very interesting. They have those big kind of cobblestones like you see in Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the Rhône, but the acidity of the soil, it just is a little bit higher than the typical region. So on the pH scale, it's a lower pH in the vineyard soil, and inversely that results in wines that are higher pH and tend to be, you know, close to 4 on the pH scale. So they tend to have that really broad, intense texture. As a grape, Syrah is sensitive to that harvest timing, like we were saying before. So the longer it hangs, it tends to lose acidity and aromatics. In the region of Côte Rôtie in the Rhône Valley, we see that Viognier is used as a blending component. And I think this is mostly because it just happens to be grown in the area, and there's often Viognier co-planted in the vineyards. And over time, they just said, okay, let's just let a little bit of Viognier go into the Côte Rôtie wines. But an interesting phenomenon is that if there's some Viognier in the blend, it actually helps to make the color of the wine darker. The Viognier kind of gives more attachment points to the color molecules. They're called anthocyanins. So basically, Viognier adds aromatics, but also helps to make the wine darker. And then this aromatic chemical, rotundon, is an important element that adds that black pepper, oregano, geranium, maybe white pepper, who knows? Pink peppercorn, green peppercorn, every color. So that's a big unique factor on Syrah. In terms of French appellations, there's maybe a technical takeaway here is this IGP, so Indication Géographique Protégée. That basically means that the wine came from that place on the map, but they can make the wine any way they want. Versus AOP, Appellation d'Origine Protégée, means it came from that place on the map and it's made according to the rule book for that region. So a little bit more strict. People say this like with Champagne, well, it's only Champagne if it comes from the Champagne region of France. That's true, but it also has to be made according to the Champagne method and aged for a certain amount of time. So if you see AOP on a label, that means that they're following the rule book. But some producers don't play by the rules, so they might do what's called declassifying, and they'll declassify their wine to IGP or even Vin de France if they don't want to play by any rules at all. Famous French appellations for Syrah include Côte Rôtie, Saint Joseph, Crozes Hermitage, and Cornas. And for the most part, those all allow for some white grapes to be blended in. But with Cornas, it really is 100% Syrah is the rule. And those wines tend to be kind of hard as nails in their youth and require 10 or 15 years of age to come around and be drinkable, versus things like Saint Joseph and Crozes Hermitage are quite open and accessible in their youth, with Côte Rôtie and Hermitage being in the middle. Another favorite French Syrah outside of the Rhône that I love is Domaine de Trevallon. And I want to show you this label on Trevallon because it's so beautiful.
Hey, Nick, before you go there, is AOP the new AOC?
Yeah, so AOP is something that came about in the last 10 years or so. It's the same thing as AOC. There's a whole wine law discussion on EU regulations that we could get into. But basically, if you see AOP on a label, it's the same thing as AOC. So,
Thank you.
yeah, all right. So this is Trevallon right here. So again, we're seeing this IGP labeling here. So they're blending Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon in equal measure, which doesn't apply to any AOP, so they're just saying the wine comes from Alpille, which is in Provence, and we're making it our own way, but they're very awesome. I recommend them. In terms of world appellations, in Australia, excellent Syrah from Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale. United States, we're talking about Columbia Valley, Walla Walla Valley, Napa Valley, and Central Valley, California. Maybe not the most quality Syrah, but I would say the bulk of Syrah plantings in the country are in this Central Valley of California, like near Fresno and Lodi. Some great Italian Syrah is made in Tuscany, especially in the area called Cortona. And then in South Africa, you might see the wine label Shiraz, like they do in Australia, from Stellenbosch and Swartland. Now, I like doing some research using Cellar Tracker, and Cellar Tracker is a very cool tool to see what's in people's cellars. And if you just search for Syrah, the most of the plantings, or most of the bottles that are in people's cellars are in the USA, followed by Australia, France, and South Africa. So kind of interesting to see that, but also a lot of Canadian Syrah, which doesn't really jive with the amount of plantings in the world, but interesting way of looking at that. So fun research tool if you want to get into Cellar Tracker. And then on viticulture, Syrah is a very vigorous vine. So that means a lot of leafy green material. It doesn't have to do with the fruit. It's just that the vine itself produces all of this green material, which has to be managed in the vineyard. It ripens pretty soon after veraison. So the term veraison is when the grapes change from green into red. And so with veraison and Syrah, basically after they turn color, it's going to become almost peak ripeness pretty soon after. It's sensitive to soils that have limestone, or sensitive to soils that have calcium carbonate. So it's not recommended to plant on those limestone soils. And we see in the Rhône, it's more schist and granite as the base of the soils, and not limestone like we find in Burgundy with Pinot Noir. So for that reason, it's not recommended to graft onto 110R rootstock, which has a kind of a lower limestone resistance. Other rootstocks are recommended. So that's a technical note if you're planting Syrah. There is a risk near harvest for mites and botrytis. And there's a couple different variants of Syrah clones, but the best are the small berried variants versus Grosses Syrah. So some technical aspects of viticulture. there's an issue that happens specifically with the Syrah grape variety called Syrah decline, or in French, dépérissement, which is this phenomenon that was discovered in the 1990s, where Syrah vines, the trunk swells, the leaves become red too soon, vigor declines, and then the vine dies over the course of like 3 years. And they realized that there's certain clones that are susceptible, but clones 470, 524, and 747 are better. So if you're planting Syrah, avoid 110R rootstock and go for these clones 470, 524, and 747. I don't know if anyone is planning on planting Syrah this year, but if you are, keep that in mind. Now, stem inclusion in whole cluster is a common aspect of winemaking with Syrah, and I think adds a lot in varying degrees. Basically, whole bunches can be used, where basically you bring the grapes in and sort whole bunches, and you're kind of looking for any material other than grapes that ends up in the fermenter and sorting that out. But then the whole bunches go in and with the stems. Or another way to do that is to actually de-stem all of the fruit and then add stems back in, sort of as a measured recipe. Some New World producers do that, or a combination. But basically, when the bunches are whole, it makes it hard if you're doing a punch down to break through the cap and to break those berries and release the juice. So fermentation ends up being slower, which adds more time for color extraction and development of flavors during fermentation. The stems also add their own tannin and structure and flavor. And then when it comes to do draining, the stems kind of create an interlocking web, and it improves the quality of free run because the stems are acting a bit like a mesh sieve and catching solid material, and the free run can be pretty clear that way. Also during whole cluster, if the berries are not broken, then we'll get some carbonic fermentation, which will add a little bit of alcohol development, but will be a lot more flavor development with these bright floral aromatics and fruit flavors. And this is a common practice with Syrah, along with Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir, and Gamay Noir, use of whole cluster. Just a couple more slides here, and then we can get into all your questions. The parents of Syrah, it's a little bit mysterious, but it kind of started with Pinot Noir maybe a couple hundred years ago, and then there was somebody in between. So Pinot Noir had a baby with somebody, and then they had a baby, two babies, Giraldago and Duresa. So those are siblings. Then Duresa met Mondeuse Blanche and made Syrah. That's kind of the story there. So in that flow, Syrah is the great grandchild of Pinot. And Pinot actually is the daddy of a bunch of different grapes. If you talk like just Pinot and Gouais Blanc, they made Chardonnay, Gamay Noir, Melon de Bourgogne, Auxerrois, Romain-Rantin. So just those two parents made a bunch of grapes. So if we're looking at a chart here, Pinot Noir came at the top, and then a few generations later, we have Syrah. And there's other kind of relationships to Viognier and Lagrein and some of these grapes you may have heard of. But this is from a beautiful book called Wine Grapes by Jancis Robinson and company. And it's one of my favorite wine books, so I highly recommend it. It's just called Wine Grapes, and that's it.
Where's Duresa from?
Duresa, it's also from that kind of Rhône area, and Mondeuse Blanche. These parent grapes are really not seen anymore in significant plantings. But yeah, there might be something like 3 hectares of Duresa left in the world. We do see Giraldago.
I love Giraldago in Italy.
Yeah, kind of from the Trentino area. Man, it makes me want to take a trip. Let's go. let's do a group field trip together and go check out the Rhône and Trentino Alto Adige. Some other ways to say Syrah, of course, we know Shiraz, which might be seen in Australia and South Africa. In Côte-Rôtine, you might see Syrine. In Australia, it's actually sometimes known as Hermitage. And then a fun one, super obscure, is Condive, which is near Lyon and Côte-Rôtine. So, you know, there's some grapes that have synonyms we might know. Let's say like Cabernet Franc, known as Breton. That's like somewhat common, or I don't know. Grape synonyms are a fun sort of thing that we study for our SOM exams, but I don't know if they really matter. Anyways, I think we're getting right to an hour, but I have plenty of time to answer questions. And I actually haven't been looking at the chat while I was talking, but it looks like there's plenty of stuff here. So, okay, so I'll start with this one about how is fermentation slower with whole cluster. So if we think about it, if grapes are destemmed, then the skins are immediately being pierced, because if you think of a table grape, as soon as you pluck the grape off of the stem, then you can just barely press and some juice will come out. So that means that the juice is now in contact with air, which has yeast, or if there's commercial yeast being added, which is fine, it will immediately interact with that juice. If it's whole clusters going in, then the clusters that are unbroken will just sort of sit there and do nothing. So the fermentation will be delayed until someone comes in with a punch down tool and breaks those clusters up. But because the punch down tool can't break through the rachis, which is that stem, the skeleton, it will delay certain grapes from bursting until maybe 5 or 6 days into fermentation. So long story short, fermentation starts when the grapes have the skins have broken, and if it's whole cluster, it just delays the breaking of those skins. Let's see. If anybody has questions or wants to share opinions or talk to me, you are welcome to. I want to make sure I cover everything. I think I just unloaded a ton of information all at once, so you'll have to kind of bear with me on that. But I really love the Rhône region. I've visited there actually in person, and the landscape. I visited Washington State vineyards too, and the landscape is totally different. In Côte-Rôtine, the vineyards are essentially vertical. They're very, very steep and very difficult to work. Versus in Washington State, they're on a slope. Most vineyards are on a slope, whether let's say De Brule or Red Willow. There's a somewhat of a slope, but that land is very different, and I think that results in part of the personality of each wine. But if I were to, here's a question here from Lynn about the classroom description of each wine, as if I were in a testing situation. And I think what I would do is actually, I don't remember which of my glasses is which here. So we'll just pick one randomly, and I'll see if I can guess which one I have. So even side by side, I can immediately tell that the lighter one is the Rhône Syrah. So that's a giveaway here now that we've had that talk. But I'll go ahead and do I'll go ahead and do one wine as a grid breakdown. So Jen, will you here? Never mind. All right. I'm just gonna go ahead and pour some wine in one of these glasses. And yeah, okay. So here we are. I didn't see what wine it was exactly, but here's my little handheld glass. So wine number one is a red wine. It is clear, so not hazy, with a high intensity of color. The primary color is purple with some ruby highlights, but it's purple all the way through with a high staining of the tears, no gas, no sediment. Overall, tears and viscosity appears to be high. So I'm guessing that this is a highly pigmented grape variety. On the nose, the wine is sound with a high aromatic intensity, showing a youthful condition, not an aged wine, but it's a fresh, youthful wine with a high intensity of aromatics. Main fruits here, we're looking at fresh, ripe black fruits, blackberry, blackcurrant, black plum, with a whole host of non-fruit aromatics here. So on the floral side, there's violets. On the green side, there is oregano and rosemary. On a culinary aspect, we're seeing black pepper. There's also some funky aromas here, like beef jerky and a little bit of animal, petting zoo, but not in a bad way. And some definite minerality here. I'm getting a sense of like crushed granite and rocks. But also supporting all of that is a sense of baking spices. So things we would bake cookies with, vanilla, cinnamon, even toasted bread, baking spices. So, not all those aromatics like petting zoo are what we want to think about when we're drinking wine. But, if my power of suggestion is there, maybe you'll get some in the background. But overall, this wine is focused on fruit, and that's the primary notes I'm getting. On the palate,
Baby animals or as grown up animals?
so on the palate here, the wine is dry. I'm not getting any residual sugar. It's a full body, so it's very round, mouth coating, and the fruits are just as ripe as they were on the nose, but even riper with those blackberry, black cherry, black plum, and currant. Not as many of those non-fruit elements on the palate. It's more about the fruit here, but still with the oregano and black pepper and some vanilla and baking spice. Alcohol is elevated. I'd say medium plus on the alcohol. Tannin medium, and then acidity is medium. So the main structural element that stands out is the alcohol, followed by tannin and then acid. The wine is well balanced with all of its components, but with fruit and alcohol at the front of a strong complexity and a long finish. Overall, I think because of the fruit focus here, this is a wine from the New World, from a warm climate. The fruit has seen some ripeness from a warm climate. Possible grapes, we're looking at a highly pigmented aromatic red grape. So, Syrah is on the table here. We would also compare this with Malbec and perhaps Zinfandel. So Syrah, Malbec, and Zinfandel are always the kind of challenging triangle of these fruity red grapes from the New World. And so pulling them apart, Syrah definitely having more of those herbaceous and savory aromatics. Malbec having more of a focus on a sour blue fruit core to it. There's always sort of a tartness with Malbec that is different than Syrah, with blue fruit and more of like a coffee chocolate aromatic. And then with Zinfandel, we get red, black, and blue fruit of multiple ripenesses, and that comes from what's called millerandage in the vineyard, where there's underripe and overripe berries on the same bunch. And so we get red, black, and blue fruit with Zinfandel and aromatics like ivy stems and peach yogurt. It's really a cool grape. But definitely this isn't one of those. This is Syrah, and we would say it's from the New World. And possible countries could include United States, Australia, maybe we could even think of Argentina. Possible vintage, we're looking at, I would say, 1 to 3 years old here, not a super old wine. Final conclusion, this is a red wine from the New World, from the United States, from Washington State, from Columbia Valley, from Yakima Valley. We could even pretend that we're getting within Yakima Valley to Red Mountain from the 2018 vintage from a high quality producer.
So Nick, do you think that the old world, their alcohol is traditionally a lot less than New World? Because this is only 12%, whereas the Columbia Valley is what, 14%. So to me, that's quite a difference.
It's quite a difference. I think it's a stylistic choice, but it's also the fact that we see higher alcohol in the Rhône, more in the southern Rhône. So it's very common for Chateauneuf de Pape to be in the 14.5, even 15 degree alcohol range with Grenache. But in the northern Rhône, we really don't see high alcohols unless the vintage demands it. Interestingly, like 2018 was pretty warm in France, and we saw like areas of Beaujolais get higher, than 14%. So I suspect that part of this is just early picking and trying to preserve a fresh tart character to the wine itself. I mean, it's kind of this triangulation of climate, specific vineyard, and winemaker decisions. So if they just say pick 4 days earlier, you can shave off some alcohol, or even doing things like adding some water into the ferment can adjust alcohol. There's a lot of different ways to land on a specific alcohol, but I think that stylistically this is typical for the Rhône to be somewhere between 12 and low 13s.
Hey, Nick, if you were grading this on the 20-point UC Davis scale, what would be your shoot from the hip score? 18, or what do you think?
On the just the quality of the wines?
Yeah, just the 20-point UC Davis scale.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that both wines are. I would say they're both. Man, it's kind of hard to say. I guess I wouldn't rate one higher than the other per se, but 16 or 17. They're high quality wines. In my mind, I'm comparing them with all the wines that I would rate lower and all the epic wines that I would rate higher. For $25, $30 wines, these are amazing. I think that they actually exceed the price point that they're at. So maybe I would give them like a 19 out of 20, given the price point and the knowledge of how much they cost. You compare this Colline Rodanienne to the Faury Côte Rôtie, it would get a lower rating. Or Jamais or Chave that I mentioned earlier, it'd get a lower rating. So I think that I would go out and drink these wines any day and love them. So
Great, thanks.
Kind of a I'm a little bit avoiding your question, but also just because I think there's so much of a wine marketing that happens based on points that you go to a lot of these wine stores and they're really quick to point out, 94 points from Robert Parker or whatever. And there's so much more of the story to that. Now, given which of these two I like better, I tend to enjoy lighter wines. So I would go for the French one if really forced to choose, versus a lot of people I know enjoy the fuller, richer wines and would love the Owen Roe. So, it's a bit of a toss up, but I think in a blind tasting, actually, these are pretty spot on. It would be pretty easy for me to get to Rhône with the French one. On the Washington one, it would be maybe tricky to get to Washington versus California. Now, I could definitely know it's not Australian, because Australian Shiraz tends to have much more inky color. It can often be so dark in pigment that you can't see through it. And part of the reason for that is the ozone is less developed or it's thinner, basically, it's burned away in the Southern Hemisphere. So more light gets onto the vineyards, more VA light, and the grapes, they boost up their color pigmentation, kind of as sunscreen in a way to protect themselves. So the color of Southern Hemisphere wines, especially in Australia, tends to be much darker. And frankly, they have eucalyptus growing everywhere in Australia, and those oils, they get into the air and then onto the grapes. So there typically is a eucalyptus note on Australian wines.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Nick, I've got a question about fermenting with whole clusters, which you referred to a couple of times.
Yes, sir.
And the question being is that when you do that, one adds tannins to the wines, it would seem like. And that sounds like you're trading that against color and things coming off the skins and things. So, and sort of delayed fermentation. So we've had problems in the past of having what I thought were kind of excessive tannins. So how do you kind of manage that trade-off? Because I think when you put the clusters in, you get more tannins, don't you? Would that be true?
Yes, I mean, part of it has to do with the ripeness of not just the fruit, but the ripeness of the stems. There's kind of a, oh yeah, I'll stop my, there we go. There we go. Not only does the fruit ripen in a vineyard, but the stems ripen as well. So if the stems are not ripe enough, they can add a lot of green, kind of harsh tannins there. If tannins being too high is an issue, I mean, I'm not a winemaker, but I would look at the ripeness of your fruit and make sure that it's not underripe. I would also look at your barrels, and if you're using newer barrels, those are going to add a little bit of tannin to the wine. And also look at the duration of a cold soak. If you have maybe a shorter cold soak, that might lead to less extraction and less tannin. So,
okay. So if we had really well ripened stems, then we wouldn't be adding clusters. Would not be such a risk to the tannins. Would that be correct?
Yeah, there's a process called lignification, where the stems turn more woody and that kind of more crunchy, and that will usually lead to less tannin. But you also have to make sure that the fruit is not overripe at the same time. So it's kind of a balancing act, and one of the winemaker's biggest decisions to make is when to pick and harvest. But that can be difficult in Washington State because so much fruit is purchased on contract that the vineyard crews have to be scheduled, 3 or 4 days in advance to know to go pick that block for you. They can't just pick it the day of, they have to be scheduled in advance. So I think Washington State has a whole set of unique challenges and when to pick and also how to get the grapes, to where you are in intact and not bruised or broken. So
yeah.
Interesting state that we have here.
Hey, Dennis,
Yes.
what I found with, excuse me, whole cluster is, I mean, you definitely want to have brown woody stems just so that you can get the kind of notes you're looking for. But I have not had issues with tannins. What I have had, and I assume this is because of potassium in the stems, I've had absolutely crazy drops in acidity, drops in TA and raising pH. From a whole cluster. So there's a few things you got to balance there. I mean, it affects a number of different parameters, including, flavors and tannins and that kind of thing.
So you wouldn't want to go in with clusters that had kind of green stems. You'd want woody stems. And then you would also, I guess that's kind of a key thing is whether you wanted to try to incorporate clusters or not, I guess. Would that be true?
Well, I mean, yeah, incorporating clusters, it's both for the whole berries have one effect, and then the inclusion of stems, can have another effect. But the most pronounced effect would be from the inclusion of stems and what the characteristics of the stems are.
Okay, so definitely don't go into any kind of green stems.
I wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay.
Man, this makes me want to hang out with y'all when it comes harvest time and
hey,
kind of see what you're doing.
We would love it if you did.
We have work.
Welcome.
Could I do like a foot trod, punch down? Would that be okay?
I think foot trotting punch downs are only okay if you're under the age of 12. That's a policy in my home.
Okay.
If you want to come to Crush and help, no problem.
I had a question for you. One of the things I was surprised about it from at the very beginning when you mentioned that Spain has more Syrah than like the United States.
Yeah, I know. I learned that today when I was kind of putting the.
Where is that? I mean, I know that there's Syrah and the Priorat, but that's such a small area, and it's not even a predominant grape there.
Or
Well-
this is the one with the white peppers, Syrah. It's just disgusting thing.
Yeah, what's interesting about Spain is they have a grape called Irene, which no one's ever heard of, but for a long time was the most planted grape in the world. So, interesting thing with Spain is they just have vast sort of fields of vines that some people don't even tend; they just grow on their own. But Spain makes a lot of wine, and I think they just have a lot of land and just plant all day long, and it's all dry farmed and just kind of does its own thing. So
more for personal consumption kind of thing rather than export.
I think it just they call it like vino de tavola or vino de mesa, and it will probably not carry a grape variety on the name. Just be red wine, and you go down to the tap and at the grocery store and just fill up a jug and take it home. That's pretty common in Europe. Is like at the store you have a container at home, like a growler basically, and you just fill it up for €3 and you have 8 liters of wine. So
Yeah, but those are not really great wines. So we did have this experience in Italy, and it's just it's not really. I mean, they're drinking it, but it's not for the art of the wine.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and that's the same thing with France has.
If you're paying $1,500 for a ticket, you don't want to drink that wine just for experience of drinking from the bucket.
Well, Elena, I think you need to come with me on my next trip to Europe, and you can show me the good stuff.
No, it's not. I think Joe is a better source of the knowledge of travel and from.
Joe can come too.
Yeah. So.
Yeah,
I'd love to. I mean, always. Hey, another question for you. What do you think as climates change and things like that? What are some of the areas that you think are or will become emerging Syrah areas?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to look at Bordeaux, and they've authorized a whole host of, I think, 7 new grapes in the last couple of years, such as Touriga Nacional from Portugal and Marcelin and these hot climate grapes.
To be labeled as Bordeaux?
To be labeled, it's just Bordeaux AOP.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, no idea.
Yeah. So these changes are already coming into effect, and we're seeing, champagne vintages actually become more consistently good because of climate change. And
champagne moves to Antarctica.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing even England have good sparkling wine now, and we'll be able to do wine tours in Greenland pretty soon. So, I think if I were to guess about Syrah in France, I mean, I don't know, maybe. I don't think Burgundy is going to be seeing much Syrah because the soil's not right. It's too much limestone. But maybe in the Jura, there could be some Syrah. I don't know where. Maybe in Poland, we'll see some good Polish Syrah. Or
oh wow, is there much wine in Poland?
No, I don't think so. But Azerbaijan, they could be an upcoming region, or Belarus, I hear is coming up. So,
have you had any of the Syrahs from the Willamette Valley? They're planting quite a bit more down there.
I've not had too many from Willamette Valley. I have had some good ones from Southern Oregon. So we're talking down like Umpqua Valley, Rogue Valley.
But that's warm down there compared to the Willamette.
Yeah. Willamette, they'll plant all kinds of things in Willamette. They'll plant Nebbiolo, and they'll do like carbonic Nebbiolo aged in amphora, with like a goat skin cover, they're kind of crazy in Willamette Valley.
That's why I like the Willamette Valley.
Yeah, me too. Washington isn't as hippie as like Columbia Gorge on the Oregon side, and like Willamette Valley, they have more dreadlocks down there. But I think, yeah, there's some good Syrah from Southern Oregon. I haven't really tried many from Willamette. Idaho is up and coming. You know, what do they call it? Snake River Valley, Lewis Clark AVA. So, you know, if you're doing some boating on Coeur d'Alene, you can go over and maybe try some Syrah from there. There's actually wine made in every state in the union. I don't think Alaska can really grow Vitis vinifera, but I think they do bring the fruit in and make wine there. But, you know, in Iowa and in Arkansas and everywhere, there's winemaking happening. Which is
What
pretty cool.
about Texas and New Mexico?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of viticultural areas in Texas and New Mexico too.
The problem with those guys down there in Texas is they just love this sweet wine, and you know, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, unmute yourself, Jen.
No, so they
Okay,
don't have
so I have to, sorry guys, I've been moderating, but I have to chime in because I just spent 10 years in Texas and I've been working in the wine industry, and I worked in a town called Fredericksburg, which actually has the second most wineries per capita next to Napa. I'm not saying all of the wine is good. There are a few wineries that are good, but not that many. I would probably say less than 5, but it is very popular. There's a lot of Tempranillo. It's a lot of drier wines because of the climate, but yes, Texas has a lot of wine. That's all I wanted to say, but I had to chime in. So, oh, also I saw some of you guys with Coug stuff on. Go Cougs.
Jennifer, I would agree with you.
Go
I would
dogs,
agree
actually,
with
go
you,
dogs.
Jennifer. And we've traveled around the United States. There's a difference between making wine and making palatable wine.
I couldn't agree more.
One of the better wines is in Wichita Falls, northern Texas. But there's a lot
That
of the
is so obscure, and I absolutely love it.
Either grape juice or or the wine, and bottling it on site, so they could say bottled on site. And this included places like what was the name in Asheville? Anyway, yeah, it's all over, and yeah, Virginia is making some very nice wines, but it's what you consider something that is palatable, is a whole nother realm. You could probably make wine in Alaska, but it's going to be made out of concentrate in somebody's backyard.
Well, you know, I'll concentrate on that idea. And no, I went to, what was it, Missouri, and visited an area called Augusta. And Augusta, when the AVA system was first established in 1980, Augusta, Missouri was the first AVA. I think they just got their paperwork in earlier than Napa Valley. And so I was like, I want to see Augusta. And so I drove there, and it's a really beautiful windy road with a lot of goats and alpaca. And they grow things like Chardonnay and Norton, and that's their pride and joy in Augusta. But really, everywhere in the East Coast, those are like, a lot of them are either hybrids or they're Vitis labrusca or Vitis riparia. There's all those North American vines that are known for having a foxy flavor. We were talking about petting zoo earlier, but like a fox kind of flavor is common with these.
Well, they have to, because a lot of the grapes there are subjected to the pathogens of the East Coast, the high humidity, high temperature, a lot of the fungus that grows back there. So the native Lambrusca species can endure a lot of those pathogens. Here in the Pacific Northwest, you know, it's only 15,000-year-old soil, maybe 20,000-year-old soil. So we're dealing with relatively sterile soil. So we can grow in Eastern Washington grapes on their own vines, on their own roots, pretty much like in Australia. We do have phylloxera now in Eastern Washington, by the way, but we can grow we have a very unique climate, which makes Washington State so so pronounced in the quality of the wines, you know, much better than say, than any place else in the United States other than maybe California. And that's
Well,
just me, but that's.
Oh, wait, or Oregon. Sorry, Steve, you forgot
Oregon, sorry, you're right. Yeah, very much so. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, Washington is pretty unique, both in terms of the climate. It gets cold enough that scares off a lot of the invaders that would hurt a vine. But the soil, you know, there's a lot of this loess soil in eastern Washington, which is kind of this kind of sandy, powdery soil. That's really good for grape health. It's very dry. Humidity is a big fungal concern in a lot of wine growing areas in the world. So dry areas are great for anti-fungus. And yeah, up until a few years ago, phylloxera, the louse, was not found in Washington, but there are small areas, including Walla Walla, that have a bit, and they're trying to manage it. But I think just like a lot of pathogens and invaders, it can be hard to control, you know. So
yeah, Oregon has had a lot of phylloxera in recent times, and a lot of these vineyards that are, you know, 30, 40 plus years old are being basically they've succumbed to the phylloxera, and they're being pulled out and having to be replanted on American rootstock. It's kind of sad, just because I mean, these were really old, well-established vines that were at their peak, and once they get phylloxera, they just can't produce. I mean, the fruit gets kind of a stress, kind of like a drought stress. It gets a phylloxera stress, and it just can't produce the quality of fruit, and certainly not the quantity of fruit.
Yep, and it kind of is a slow decline in the amount of fruit produced, and eventually the vine gives up the ghost. We'll hear about these ungrafted vineyards around the world that are own rooted, and they're usually on either sandy soils or they're just super isolated. So sandy soils are, let's say, on Colares in Portugal is one area that they have ungrafted vines. But also like on the Canary Islands in Tenerife, it's just in the middle of the ocean, and phylloxera never came there. So
I was
pretty
thinking
interesting.
Mount Tenerife.
Yeah. What's that?
I was thinking Mount Tenerife
Yeah. Okay.
on I-90.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask this group into food wine pairing. Did anybody put any efforts of doing something for food pairing for this wine?
I'm gonna heat up some pizza rolls here in a minute.
Like nobody. So I would like to promote some Costco stuff, and something that I did during like 30 minutes preparation for this class. So I did spaghetti from Costco, but it's lentil spaghetti. So it's lentil and water, pretty much, but nothing else. So super healthy, lentil spaghetti. And I did sausages with the with onion and tomatoes and bell pepper, and for spices, because you know it's known that Shiraz is ghost with the spicy food. I put curry, chili pepper, and cumin there. So the Yakima wine still was trying to kill my food. It was still trying. It didn't, I mean, it toned down a little bit with the food, but the French one was just blending so beautifully. So I was pretty happy about my efforts.
Oh my gosh. Well, that sounds really good.
Yeah,
I've not had lentil spaghetti before, but
lentil spaghetti, really, they, you know, as usual in Costco, they have 7 minutes al dente.
Ooh.
Really good.
Okay, Cheryl, was that
Nobody else was caring about the food wine pairing. That's sad.
Their priorities are just in making sure their glasses are full, which is the same as me.
Hey, Nick, when you look at Washington and Syrah, what are some of your favorite areas?
How, is that what your question?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my favorite is Walla Walla. I really like the intensity, the aromatics that come from Walla Walla Syrah, like the Rocks district, especially. Now, the problem is that technically on the map, part of the Rocks district is in Oregon, but it just so happens that Oregon got lucky and their border is right there. But if you look at the geology, you know, it's basically a continuation of up in Columbia Valley up north. So I really like the Rock Syrah, but the next would be probably Willamette Valley, or not Willamette Valley, Yakima Valley would be a favorite. You know, things like Snipes Mountain or Red Mountain, or even just Yakima Valley AVA. Betts Family Winery is a favorite of mine that uses Yakima fruit. You know, the Own Row is like that. And then from Walla Walla, folks like WT Vintners and Rain Van are really great examples.
Nick, when you were talking about the rocks, you inspired me to go grab a wine from one of the wine clubs I'm in, which is Zerba.
Ooh.
And they have this one, which is the Rocks Syrah. And it's from the Rocks district of Milton Freewater.
Yeah.
But I love them. They're a great winery. If you haven't tried them yet, they're phenomenal.
Are they in Woodinville, or are they based out there? And
They have a tasting room in Woodinville, but they are actually in Milton Freewater over in, I guess they're technically in Oregon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They also have a tasting room in Dundee, Oregon.
They do. You're right.
Well, yeah, Nick, since you mentioned WT Cellars, which I really love all his Washington wines.
Yeah.
I guess I'll give a pitch to us as a club, because if you want to try a really good Syrah from one of our sources, get the WT Cellars. Nick, do you remember the name for the Lake Colleen vineyard? It's like Damian or something like that.
Damavian.
What's that again, please?
Damavian.
Damavian.
Yeah.
So yeah, WT Cellars or Vintners, WT Vintners in Woodinville. And if you want to try a Lake Colleen, one of our club sources, Syrah, get the Nick again.
Damavian.
Yeah, the Syrah called that. It's
Damavian.
very. I mean, they do such a great job. He's a great winemaker.
He is. He's a talented sommelier as well.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Well, I think I'll wrap things up on my end here. It's been a pleasure to taste with you and present to you today, and definitely feel free to follow up with me for any other questions, and I hope to talk to you again.
Thank you, Nick. That was awesome.
Much, Nick.
Thank you.
All right.
Nick.
Great job, Nick.
Come back
Thanks.
again.
Do this again. It was
Take care.
very enjoyable.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.
I'm going off mute. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Stacy.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Should I just?
Good night.
He knows all about here.
Thank you, Lorraine.